The unwanted visitor in the parking garage. That first night, I noticed him right as I finished my rounds on level B2. It was around 2 a.m., and honestly, I don't usually see anyone down there that late. This guy was just standing there, near one of the cars, leaning against the hood like he owned the place. He was tall, mid-40s maybe, wearing a plain dark jacket and a ball cap pulled low, so I couldn't really see his face. I walked over and asked if he needed help, but he barely looked at me and just muttered that he was waiting for a friend. Everything about him seemed off. He wasn't fidgety or lost, more like bored. I told him the garage was closed to visitors and that he'd need to leave, but instead of answering, he gave me this look, a mix of anger and amusement. He walked off, real slow, without saying anything else. The next night, I figured it was just a one-time thing. But halfway through my shift, I saw him again. Same spot, near a different car this time, almost like he wanted to be seen. When I approached, he started walking away before I even got close. Something about the way he moved made me uneasy. It was like he wanted me to follow him. I didn't, but I stayed nearby, keeping an eye on him until he left. A few hours later, as I wrapped up for the night, I noticed a note on the windshield of one of the cars near where he'd been standing. It was a mess of scribbled words. Nothing clear except for the last line, "I'm watching." It sounds crazy, but I swear my stomach dropped. I tried to brush it off as some random creep, but the third night he was back. Same routine. He showed up on B2, loitering just out of the range of the cameras, staying close to the shadows between the cars. By then, I was on edge, my gut telling me this was more than just someone waiting for a friend. I called it in to my supervisor, but since he hadn't done anything illegal, they didn't take it seriously. That didn't sit right with me, especially after finding more notes, this time on different cars throughout the garage. They all had the same scrawled handwriting, with weird phrases like, "You don't know what's coming," or "See you soon." I'd be lying if I said I wasn't starting to feel nervous each time I had to check that level. By the fifth night, I was so anxious that I couldn't focus on anything else. I tried to tell myself he'd get bored eventually, maybe find someone else to mess with, but deep down, I knew he wasn't done. The whole night I was waiting for him to appear, but he never did. Just as I started to relax, I headed out to my car around 4 a.m., feeling more exhausted than usual. That's when I saw him. He was leaning against my car, just standing there, looking right at me with this strange, cold smile. For a split second, I froze. The entire garage felt like it shrunk around me. I wanted to turn around, go back inside, but I was already too close, and he could tell I was scared. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched me as I approached, that smile never dropping. I forced myself to act calm, told him he needed to leave, that I'd call the police if he didn't. He just chuckled, this low, mocking laugh that seemed way too loud in the empty garage. Then he finally spoke. His voice was rough, almost a whisper, and he said, "You think you can keep me out?" Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It didn't feel like he was talking about just the garage. I held my ground, though my hands were shaking, and told him I was serious about calling the cops. That's when he stepped back, raising his hands as if in surrender, then turned and walked away. I practically ran to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got in. My heart was racing, and I felt this awful mix of relief and dread. I kept looking around as I drove out, half expecting him to be hiding somewhere, watching me leave. But the worst part came the next morning when I checked my car. There was another note, tucked under my windshield wiper. It was short, just one line. "You'll never be safe." I don't know why, but that note hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't just a threat, it felt like a promise. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me everywhere I went. At work, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the security monitors, half expecting to see him lurking in some dark corner of the garage. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. It got so bad that I asked to switch to a day shift, but they said no, they were already short on night staff. So I kept showing up, dreading each night more than the last, but he didn't show again for over a week. I started to think maybe it was over, that he'd finally moved on. I was almost able to convince myself that I'd overreacted, that maybe he was just some deranged guy messing around. Then, 2 weeks later, he returned, just as suddenly as he'd disappeared. This time, I spotted him as soon as I got out of the elevator. He was near the back of the garage, leaning against a car, looking straight at me like he'd been waiting all night. I didn't even try to confront him. I just backed up, ready to call the police. But as I reached for my phone, he lifted his arm and pointed, slowly, in my direction, mouthing something I couldn't hear. I felt a wave of panic hit me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the phone. I backed away to a safer spot by the elevators, but before I could dial, he turned and walked calmly out of sight, vanishing into the shadows between the cars. I stayed there, frozen, clutching my phone, trying to decide if I should go after him or just leave. After a few minutes, I pulled myself together and called my supervisor, but by the time backup arrived, he was long gone. We searched the whole garage, every level, every corner, but it was like he'd vanished. I thought about quitting after that night, but part of me didn't want to let this creep scare me away from my job. Still, I couldn't ignore the fear that now settled into my daily routine. I started changing up my schedule, leaving by different exits, doing everything I could to avoid being predictable, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I felt hunted, like he was somewhere close, just waiting for the right moment. Then, the last time I saw him was almost a month later. I just finished my shift, trying to keep calm as I walked back to my car, looking around like I always did now. The garage was silent except for my footsteps. As I reached my car, I glanced into the back seat, a habit I'd picked up from a lifetime of watching too many horror movies. My heart nearly stopped. There, on the back seat, was one last note, folded neatly. I didn't even need to open it to feel the dread seep through me, but I did anyway. It read, "See you soon." And that was it. He never showed up again. But even now, every time I park alone or walk to my car at night, I can't help but feel like he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. The obsessive regular at the small cafe. I remember when he first came into the cafe. It was a slow Tuesday morning, barely a handful of regulars around, and this man, mid-40s maybe, dressed in a worn-out coat and an odd, fixed expression, walked in, looking a bit out of place. I didn't think much of him back then. He ordered a coffee, black, and sat in my section by the window. The cafe's pretty small, so everyone sort of blends together in there, but he had this weird habit of staring, not at the other customers or even at the decor, but straight at me, without breaking eye contact whenever I passed by. It was unsettling, but in my line of work, you get used to quirky types. When he left, though, he tipped twice as much as the coffee was worth and scribbled a quick "nice meeting you" on the back of his receipt. I shrugged it off as a friendly gesture. The next day, he came in again. And the day after that, and then almost every day. Always around the same time, always requesting my section, and always with that intense stare that made me avoid looking at him directly. I started noticing other details, too, like how he'd stay longer than most, even after finishing his coffee. He'd sit there, occasionally jotting something down on a napkin, just waiting until my shift was almost over. Sometimes, he left little notes, odd messages like, "I know you like coffee too," or "Hope you had a good day yesterday," things he couldn't have known unless he'd been watching me closely. After a couple of weeks, his visits started to feel suffocating. It was no longer just a friendly, regular vibe. He'd begun asking personal questions, dropping unsettling hints about my routine, and even noting when I'd changed something, like a new hairstyle or a different shade of lipstick. Once, he casually mentioned where I lived, saying, Must be a nice walk home from here. I hadn't told him where I lived. That comment made my stomach drop, but I forced a polite smile and stepped away to the kitchen, feeling my hands tremble. I told myself he was just an awkward guy, maybe a little lonely. Still, I started keeping my phone close and watching the door more often. My manager noticed I was jumpy, but I brushed it off, not wanting to cause a scene. Things escalated last Tuesday, right at the end of my shift. He waited until I was leaving to approach me in the parking lot. Normally, I'd be gone before him, but that night I'd stayed late to help clean up. I didn't even see him until I was nearly at my car, and there he was, just standing by the driver's side door. When I tried to walk past, he moved to block my way, his face shadowed in the dim parking lot light, looking more agitated than usual. He muttered something about how he didn't appreciate being ignored and how I'd been leading him on. I felt this rising panic. He was close, too close, and his tone was sharper, almost desperate. I tried to play it calm, apologizing and making excuses, hoping he'd let me by, but he wouldn't budge. At that moment, I realized I needed to get out of there, fast. My heart was racing, and every nerve in my body screamed to run, but he had me cornered against the side of my car. He started saying things that made my skin crawl, about how he'd been patient, and how he deserved more than just a polite nod each day. I tried to move again, but he grabbed my arm, not hard, but firm enough that I knew he wouldn't let go easily. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and his face was so close, I could see the anger in his eyes. I felt a jolt of fear, realizing he'd been building up this obsession right under my nose, and now he was finally showing me his real face. I blurted out that someone was waiting for me, hoping it might shake him, but he just laughed, saying he'd never seen anyone waiting for me. Desperate, I glanced around and spotted the lights of a bar at the end of the street. I don't remember exactly how, but I managed to yank my arm free and took off running. I could hear his footsteps behind me at first, but adrenaline was on my side, and I reached the bar before he caught up. I burst through the doors, breathless, and the bartender and a few patrons looked up, instantly sensing something was wrong. The guy came in right after, looking furious and yelling something incoherent. Two men near the bar stepped in between us, and I watched as his expression shifted, his anger melting into a cold glare. He didn't want to back down, but with other people around, he finally left, muttering under his breath as he disappeared into the night. The second he was gone, I felt my knees go weak, and one of the bartenders brought me a glass of water, asking if I was okay. I tried to explain, but my voice was shaking too much to make sense. I just kept saying, he followed me, he wouldn't leave me alone, over and over, feeling like I'd barely escaped something terrible. I stayed in that bar for over an hour, too scared to go back outside alone. A couple of the regulars there offered to walk me to my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be hiding somewhere nearby, just waiting. Eventually, I called a friend to pick me up, leaving my car behind that night. I remember looking out the window the whole drive home, half expecting him to appear on the sidewalk or at a stoplight, watching me. The next day, I was still rattled, but I had to go back to work. My manager could tell something was up and pulled me aside. I finally told her everything, about the notes, the questions, the way he'd started following me. She was horrified and told me to report it, but I didn't feel like the police would do much. He hadn't actually done anything physical, aside from grabbing my arm, and I wasn't sure they'd take it seriously. But we made a plan. If he came back, my manager would confront him and tell him he wasn't welcome anymore. Thankfully, he never showed up again, but every time the door opened, I'd feel a spike of panic, wondering if he was coming back to finish what he'd started. Even now, months later, I still feel my heart race whenever I see someone who even remotely looks like him. The menacing patron at the library. I remember it was a Tuesday evening, one of those quiet, empty nights at the library where the only sounds were the soft hum of the lights and the occasional rustling of paper. We'd had a few visitors earlier in the day, but by 7, The place was practically deserted. That's when he walked in. I'd seen strange patrons before. Small towns tend to attract some interesting characters, but there was something about him that put me on edge right from the start. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark, worn coat, and his gaze was intense, almost like he was trying to read more than just the titles on the shelves. He didn't grab any books though. He just wandered around, glancing over at me every few minutes, almost like he was waiting for something. After about half an hour, he finally came over to the desk, resting his hands on the counter in a way that felt oddly aggressive, like he was trying to take up as much space as possible. His questions were unsettling. First, he asked if I was local and how long I'd been working at the library. I kept my answers short, hoping he'd get the hint, but then he started asking specifics about my schedule, when I usually left, whether I lived nearby, and even if I walked or drove home. I didn't answer most of it, brushing off his questions with polite deflections, but his persistence was making my skin crawl. I remember glancing at the clock, hoping it'd be close enough to closing time so I could tell him it was time to leave. But every time I looked away, I felt his eyes still locked on me, unblinking, as if he was waiting for something more. Finally, when closing time rolled around, I walked over to him to let him know it was time to go. He just stood there, staring at me with this expressionless look, as if he hadn't heard me at all. I had to repeat myself twice before he finally nodded, moving slowly toward the exit while still looking back at me. I could feel my pulse racing, but I tried to keep my face neutral, like I wasn't bothered. As he walked out, he paused at the door, glanced over his shoulder, and said, almost too casually, "See you tomorrow." That really shook me because it wasn't a question or a polite goodbye. It was more like a statement, like he was just letting me know he'd be back. I locked the door behind him, double-checking it, and then sat down for a minute just to collect myself before heading out to my car. The next day, I half hoped he wouldn't show up, that maybe I'd overreacted and let my imagination get the best of me. But no, right around the same time, he walked in again, looking even more focused, like he decided he had some unfinished business. He didn't browse or pretend to be interested in any of the books. Instead, he came straight up to the desk. He didn't bother with small talk this time. He just looked at me and said, "Why were you avoiding my questions yesterday?" His tone was colder, and his eyes had this intensity that made my stomach knot up. I tried to brush it off, laughing nervously and saying I was just busy, but he didn't look convinced. He leaned in closer, practically hissing, "You shouldn't ignore me. That's very rude." I felt my hands trembling, and all I could think about was how I had a few hours left before closing and no one else around to notice if something went wrong. The hours crawled by that night, and I felt trapped, constantly glancing over at him, hoping he'd just leave on his own. But he stayed, sitting in one of the chairs, arms crossed, watching me with this unnerving intensity, as if daring me to make him go. At one point, I walked into the back room to calm myself down, forcing myself to breathe and reminding myself that soon he'd have to leave. But when I came back, he was still there, still staring. It was as though he could feel my discomfort and was feeding off it. I counted down the minutes to closing, mentally rehearsing what I'd say to him to get him to leave without making him angrier. When it was finally time to close, I didn't want to walk over to him again, but I didn't have a choice. I approached, telling him we were closed, trying to keep my voice steady. He stood up slowly, and for a moment, I thought he'd finally just go, but instead, he stepped a bit closer, blocking my way. He looked me up and down, then leaned in, saying softly, "Don't think I didn't notice how you tried to hide from me." My heart was racing, and I couldn't look him in the eyes. I just muttered something about needing to finish up and took a step back, hoping he'd take the hint. He finally backed away, heading out, but not before shooting me one last look, a look that seemed to say, "This isn't over." When he was finally out the door, I locked it so fast I almost fumbled with the keys, feeling this overwhelming sense of relief, but also a fear that he really would be back. The next evening, I felt a knot in my stomach the entire time I was driving to work, hoping, praying that he wouldn't come back. But sure enough, around the same time, he strolled in, just like before. I'd never felt so tense in my life, trying to focus on my tasks but feeling his gaze on me every second. This time, he didn't even bother with questions. He just watched, eyes never leaving me, like he was studying my every move. I kept my head down, pretending not to notice, but I could feel my skin crawl every time I sensed him shifting in his chair, moving just enough to keep himself in my line of sight. I tried to tell myself he was just trying to mess with me, but deep down, I could feel something darker, something dangerous in the way he looked at me. As the night dragged on, it became harder to keep up the act. At one point, he started pacing, walking up and down the aisles, getting closer to the counter with each pass, like he was working up the nerve to do something. My hands were shaking as I checked the time, wishing the hours would go by faster. Finally, closing time rolled around again. I didn't even try to approach him this time. I just announced that we were closing, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But instead, he waited until I was at the door, keys in hand, ready to lock up, before he got up and walked toward me, mumbling something under his breath. I couldn't make it out, but I heard the word regret in there somewhere, and I felt my blood run cold. I managed to lock the door just as he reached it, keeping my back turned and hoping he'd finally just leave. But when I turned around to head to my car, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my pace exactly. He was following me. My hands were clammy, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I thought about turning around to confront him, but the way he'd been acting, the way he'd been watching me all night, it was like he was just waiting for a reason to snap. I kept walking, each step feeling heavier than the last, until I was practically running to get to my car. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door, and in those few seconds, he got even closer, muttering something about respect and how I'd ignored him. Just as I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the door, he reached out, banging on the window with an open hand. The sound was so loud it echoed in the empty parking lot, and I could see his face, twisted in frustration, his mouth moving as he kept hurling words at me that I couldn't quite hear through the glass. I didn't wait to find out what he was saying. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to get the car started. As I pulled out of the lot, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching, his face partially hidden in the shadows. I drove home as fast as I could, heart racing the entire way, feeling his eyes on me long after I'd left him behind. Since that night, I haven't felt safe locking up alone. Even though he eventually stopped showing up, there's this lingering feeling that he could return any night, waiting for me in the dark. The threatening patient at the clinic. It was a slow evening at the clinic, the kind of shift where you feel every single minute drag by. Most of my patients that night had been routine cases, sprained wrists, flu symptoms, nothing out of the ordinary. But about halfway through my shift, they assigned me a guy who came in with a minor cut on his arm. At first, he looked like any other patient, though something about him felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. He just gave off this intense energy, like he was on edge or frustrated. As I checked his chart and started asking him standard questions, he barely looked at me, his eyes darting around the room like he couldn't stand being there. After a while, he started to get visibly annoyed. I could tell he hated the waiting. It happens a lot, and normally, I just reassure patients and they calm down. But he was different. The longer he sat there, the angrier he seemed to get. He kept muttering under his breath, stuff I couldn't really make out at first. Then, out of nowhere, he just looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You know, I could find out where you live." It took me a second to process. I forced a smile, like I didn't really take it seriously, but the way he said it, too calm, too direct, chilled me. Trying to play it off, I told him we'd be with him as soon as possible, hoping he'd settle down, but he just kept staring at me with this weird intensity. I tried to keep things professional, but his gaze was relentless, and I could feel my stomach start to twist. After a few minutes, he muttered again, Maybe I'll pay you a visit after your shift. See if you're as nice outside the clinic." He said it so casually, like he was talking about the weather, but the words made my skin crawl. I wanted to ignore him, but the more he talked, the more personal his comments got. He said something about the color of my car, then mentioned a street name that sounded uncomfortably familiar, like he might actually know where I lived. At that point, I knew I needed to get someone else involved, so I quietly excused myself and went to find the on-call doctor, hoping he could step in and take over. The doctor went in to see him, but by then, the guy had quieted down, almost like he knew he'd scared me enough and was just waiting to be discharged. He watched me out of the corner of his eye the entire time the doctor examined him, a faint smirk on his face. When he finally got his discharge papers, he took his time gathering his things, his movements slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he wasn't in a hurry. I stayed behind the counter, doing my best to avoid his gaze, but every time I glanced up, he was staring straight at me. When he eventually walked out, I felt a massive wave of relief, until I noticed he hadn't left. He was just standing outside the clinic, right in front of the entrance, looking in through the glass doors, watching me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he'd leave in a minute, that he was probably just trying to get one last reaction out of me. But he didn't move. He just kept standing there, his face barely lit by the street lamp, watching me through the glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. I finished up my paperwork as quickly as I could, my eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. I didn't want to go out there with him standing right by the entrance, but I couldn't exactly stay at the clinic all night either. I told myself he'd get bored and leave eventually, but after another 15 minutes, he was still there, watching, like he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Finally, I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and decided to just make a dash for it. I walked toward the doors, trying not to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me, like they were burning holes in my back. As soon as I stepped outside, he took a small step closer, just enough to let me know he wasn't done yet. I didn't even wait to see if he was going to say something. I just headed straight for my car, practically running by the time I reached it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside and lock the doors. Once I was in, I looked back, and there he was, standing under the streetlight, his eyes fixed on my car, that unsettling smirk still on his face. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched me, standing perfectly still. I finally managed to start the car, but my heart was racing, and my hands were still shaking on the wheel. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't resist one last glance in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, just staring after me, like he was memorizing the direction I was headed. The road was nearly empty, and I felt exposed, every shadow along the way seeming to hold something sinister. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him following me, even though I knew he'd been on foot. My mind kept running over everything he'd said, especially the part about visiting me, and every time I thought about it, a fresh wave of dread hit me. When I finally got home, I parked as close to my building as possible and bolted inside, locking every single lock on my door. I remember just standing there for a minute in the silence of my apartment, trying to calm down, but every little sound seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he knew where I was. I kept thinking I'd hear a knock on the door or see his face outside my window, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak, convinced that at any moment, he'd be there. The next day, I told my supervisor what happened, but they just brushed it off as part of the job. It's been a while now, but sometimes, late at night, I still get that feeling, that he's out there, watching, just waiting.